Today, Latinos make up a large portion of the MLB, but it wasn't always like this. Like African Americans, many of them were discriminated against and prevented from joining the league before Jackie Robinson would break the color barrier. And before this happened, African American and Latino baseball players had to team up, forming a relationship that would span across 6 different nations, and both helped globalize the game of baseball and help make the MLB into what it would become today. And for this episode, Journey Through Jerseys, we'll be looking at the complete story of how the Negro Leagues in Latin America formed a relationship that would go on to change the very game of baseball.
To understand the relationship between Latin America and black baseball, we have to go all the way back to the very beginning. In 1899, when the All-Cubans, the first Latin team to tour America, played a series of games against the Cuban X-Giants, a team that was an offshoot of the Cuban Giants, which was the first black professional baseball team in America. Abel Linares, who founded the All-Cubans with Tinty Molina, challenged the X-Giants for, quote, posing as representatives of Cuba. This is because while the Cuban X-Giants, like the team they came from, had the word Cuban in their name, they didn't actually have any Cuban players on their team, though some of their players had played in Cuba before. It suggested that the name came from the fact that because a lot of the players were light-skinned, they could pass as Cuban and potentially get better treatment than if they were seen as being black. This is something that Adrian Burgos Jr., author of the book Cuban Star, attested to during an interview when discussing the ways in which Latinos integrated Major League Baseball. The All-Cubans and the X-Giants played a 2-game series in August of 1899. And this is significant because it's possibly the very first time that a Latin baseball team played against an African American baseball team. And even though the Cuban X-Giants swept this series, the matchup proved to open up a new business opportunity that would help foster a new relationship between black players and Latino players that would go on to change the MLB. A year after this matchup, the Cuban X-Giants began to tour Cuba and played against local teams, with this being the first time a black team had toured the country. And their visit may have had a major effect, because in that same year, the Cuban Baseball League dropped its color barrier, and this was long before the MLB ever did. And they even went a step further, adding a black team, the San Francisco Baseball Club, to their league. Some teams, like the Almendares, signed black players to their team. Players like Sam Jethro and future Hall of Famer Monty Earl. They would even sign black Cuban players like Jose Menendez and Angel Skull. The All-Cubans also began to change. When they first started out, the team was full of Criollos and Mestizos, but by 1902, they had signed Afro-Cubans to their team and began playing matches against other Negro League teams like the Philadelphia Giants. All is possible because of 2 games. And if you want to learn more about some of these teams, check out this playlist here. As time went on, more Cubans joined the Negro League. And by the early 1900s, the Negro League had a team that was full of Cuban baseball players called the Cuban Stars. As a matter of fact, there were multiple teams that had the name Cuban Stars. First, there was the Cuban Stars West, started by Abel Linares and Tinty Molina. And then there were the Cuban Stars East, which was started by Alex Pompez. And then there was another team called the Cuban Stars. This one was started by Sid Pollock, who was also the owner of the Indianapolis Clowns. I go into more detail about those teams in this video right here. By the 1930s, Alex Pompez created what would be the final Negro League team to have Cuban in their name, the New York Cubans. The interesting thing about this team is that they didn't just have Cubans on the team. They also had Mexicans and Dominican players. And if you want to learn more about the New York Cubans, I go into more detail about them in this video over here. The country of Cuba has had a complex relationship with the African American community and racism for a long time. Some of these complexities can be seen in the fact that while Cuba has welcomed black activists like Nelson Mandela, it's also seemingly ignored the plight of its Afro-Cuban citizens, partially as a way of preserving its quote-unquote race-blind image. The integration of baseball is just one example of that complex and yet transactional relationship, with both communities benefiting from one another through competition and collaboration. Cuban players got more opportunities to play in America, and black players got a chance to play integrated baseball at a time when their own country wouldn't allow them to. This relationship also helped play a pivotal role in reshaping the game of baseball. By the early 1900s, white Cubans had already begun to integrate the major leagues, while black Cubans and other Afro-Latinos wouldn't be represented in the MLB until almost 50 years later. In 1949, Nini Minoso, who helped the New York Cubans win their first and only Negro League World Series title, became the first Black Cuban and the first Afro-Latino to play in the MLB when he signed with the Cleveland Indians. Players like Minoso are a product of the complementary relationship between the Negro Leagues and Latin America, a relationship that has played a role in shaping baseball to be what it is today. Cuba wasn't the only Latino country to have this kind of relationship with the Negro Leagues either. Just west of Cuba, the nation of Mexico's relationship with black baseball began as far back as the late 1930s, with Satchel Paige being recognized as one of the first Negro League players to play in the country due to a change in policy with the Mexican League that allowed teams to sign up to 4 foreign players. Satchel played with the Agate club in Mexico City, and Paige wasn't the only Negro League player to make that trip to Mexico. Over the years, several players would come. Players like Willie Wells, who Mexican fans nicknamed El Diablo because of his extreme athleticism and intensity with how he played the game. One man who is said to have played a significant role in developing this relationship is a businessman and baseball executive named Jorge Pascal, who helped organize matches between white players and Negro League players to be played in Mexico. And this would mark one of the earliest occasions of black and white players going up against each other prior to the integration of baseball, and would occur in 1946, just a year before Jackie Robinson's Brooklyn Dodgers debut. Playing in Mexico provided both a social advantage due to being able to play integrated baseball and a financial one as well. One of the ways that Pascal was able to draw so many Negro League players was due to him offering them a better salary than what they can get in America. Both the MLB and some of the Negro Leagues began to retaliate against Jorge and the players that took him up on his offer. In 1946, the MLB issued a rule that prevented players who went to Mexico from returning to the MLB. On the Negro League side, Gus Greenlee, owner of the Pittsburgh Crawfords, tried to ban Satchel Paige from the Negro Leagues. Greenlee and Paige already had a strained relationship due to contractual disputes. African American players would continue to play in Mexico for the winter seasons, with teams like the Azules de Veracruz, which had players like Josh Gibson, Ray Dandridge, and Cool Papa Bell. The team was based in the Mexican state of Veracruz, where a significant number of African slaves were transported to as part of the transatlantic slave trade. This team was also managed by a player named Martin Dihigo, a man who achieved the impressive feat of being in the Hall of Fame in 5 different countries, including Mexico. And it was in Mexico that the Cuban-born player, with ties to the Negro Leagues, put up some impressive stats, with a .387 batting average. He is also credited with pitching the first no-hitter in Mexican League history. Papa Bell also had an amazing legacy in Mexico. During his time playing for Veracruz, he led all players in batting averages, home runs, and RBIs, which is known in the baseball world as a triple crown. Many Negro League players were still playing in Mexico as late as the 1960s, because although the MLB was integrated, black players still found more respect playing overseas than they did in the States. And this fact is interesting, because while black players from America received great treatment, Mexico has had a deep and documented issue with racism in their own country. To this day, darker-skinned Mexicans get treated worse than Mexicans who are more fair-skinned. With this in mind, it's almost shocking to see how well black Americans were treated in Mexico as compared to the country that they were born in. These complexities don't only exist in Mexico either, and attitudes like this can be seen across various countries in the Latino community. It should, however, be noted that, at least in the beginning of the 20th century, Mexico was seen as a safe haven for racial discrimination, and it remained as such until at least 1925, when the Mexican government began limiting immigration, sometimes based on race, a practice that they would continue until 1939, the same year that Satchel Paige began playing in Mexico. But even with these controversies in place, Mexico still offered a safe haven for black players to play and help further the agenda to integrate baseball. Southeast of Mexico, Negro League players also had a presence in the country of Venezuela, as far back as 1927, when Robert Williams played for an independent team there. Most Negro League players would begin to play in the country throughout the 1930s and 40s. Similar to Mexico, the country hosted players like Josh Gibson, who played for a team called the Centauros de Maracaibo. During one game with them, he's said to have hit a home run that went 328 feet above the outfield fence. Other Negro League stars that played in Venezuela include Quincy Troop and Martin Dihigo. And just like Venezuela received players for their teams from America, America would also receive players from Venezuela. Carlos Ascancio played for the New York Black Yankees and is the only Venezuelan to play in the Negro Leagues. Ascancio, nicknamed the Earthquake due to his powerful swing, is said to have gotten into the leagues with help from a pitcher that he met in Cuba. In an interview before his death, he said that his time with the Negro Leagues made him have a deeper appreciation for the sport of baseball, reminiscing on playing with legends like Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, and about how his fielding ability helped the Black Yankees win games. The most impactful event for Negro League baseball in Venezuela happened in 1945. The Serie Monumental was an exhibition tour that started in the winter of 1945 and ended in 1946. That featured Negro League All-Stars like Buck Leonard, Sam Jethro, and Jackie Robinson, going up against Venezuelan and Caribbean All-Star teams. The games were played in both Caracas and Maracaibo, with the Negro Leagues finishing with a 7-2 record and the Venezuelan teams finishing with a 3-4-1 record. The Caribbean teams finished with a 2-5-1 record. The series was monumental for several reasons, like the fact that it was the precursor for the Inter-American Series, which was a tournament that included American minor teams playing against South American and Caribbean teams. The Inter-American Series, which lasted from 1946 to 1965, precursor to the Caribbean Series, a tournament where Caribbean and Latin American teams would play against each other. It also helped firmly establish professional baseball in Venezuela, with the Venezuela Professional Baseball League forming in 1946, and contracting several black players who had participated in the series monumental. It also helped open the door for African American and Cuban players to come play for and manage teams in Venezuela, a relationship that continued into the 1950s, years after Jackie had broken the color barrier. While Venezuela provided opportunities for Negro League players to be respected for their game and to escape from the discrimination that they faced back home, it did so while having its own problems with race, starting from when the first African slaves arrived on Cubagua Island in the 16th century and continuing into the 20th century with their efforts to whiten the country by controlling the flow of immigration. In fact, Afro-Venezuelans were not even included in the country's censuses in the early 20th century. Like Cuba, Venezuela was operating with an ideology of mestizaje, or mixed race, which attempted to promote an idea of racial harmony by combining the mixed heritages of Venezuelan citizens from Africa and Europe to create a centralized Venezuelan identity. While promoted as a way to end racism, it may have had a hand in perpetuating it by ignoring the unique plight and identity of Afro-Venezuelans, something that continued in 1999, with the Venezuelan constitution not even recognizing Afro-Venezuelans. A 2013 Swedish study listed Venezuela as one of the most racist Latin countries. Like in Mexico, the lighter your skin, the more you're preferred. This can be seen in the country's beauty pageants, which predominantly feature European-looking Venezuelan women over Afro-Venezuelan women. This attitude hasn't just been reserved to black people in their own country. Even presidents of nations weren't exempt. With this in mind, one has to wonder just what was it about the Negro League players that got them so much respect in this country? And why did that respect for Negro League players not extend to Afro-Venezuelans? And why, in spite of their own issues with racism, did Venezuelans see something in the Negro League players that America didn't see? Just west of Venezuela, the country of Panama has its own relationship with the Negro Leagues that began in the 1940s, with Victor Greenidge in 1941 joining the New York Cubans, and becoming the first Panamanian player to play in a recognized major league. Similar to other Latin countries, Panama provided opportunities for Negro League players that they couldn't get in America, but Negro League players weren't the only ones who benefited. Several black Panamanian players were able to play in America for the first time through the Negro Leagues. Players like Leon Kelman, Frankie Austin, and Pat Scantlebury. Out of these three, Scantlebury was the only one to go to the MLB, briefly pitching for the Cincinnati Reds. Panama attracted more Negro League players in 1946 when the Panamanian Professional League was founded, with the first team being the Carta Vieja Yankees. The league officially joined organized baseball in 1948. Negro League players like Scantlebury and Chet Brewer would come down to Panama to play in the winter seasons. One event in 1947 showed just how popular the Negro Leagues were in Panama. The Brooklyn Dodgers and their farm team, the Montreal Royals, played 12 games in Panama. The Royals had players like Don Newcomb, Roy Campanella, and a young Jackie Robinson. And it's said that the Royals team, that was full of former Negro League players, attracted a bigger crowd in Panama than the Dodgers team did. And the love that they received in Panama opened up the door for opportunities for former Negro League stars in neighboring countries like Colombia in the 1940s and in Nicaragua in the 1950s. After integration, Panama continued to be a hub for former Negro League stars well into the 1970s. Panama, like other Latin countries, gave major opportunities for Negro League players to hone their skills and help further globalize the game of baseball. This relationship proved to be mutually beneficial, as Panamanian players got a chance to play professional baseball at a time when the color line would have prevented them from doing so. Players like Victor Greenidge, who paved the way for players like Scantlebury and Leon, who themselves paved the way for Humberto Robinson, the first Panamanian to play in the MLB when he signed with the Milwaukee Braves, and Hector Lopez, the first Panamanian baseball star, and the first black baseball manager at the AAA level. Panama's relationship with the Negro Leagues provided several opportunities for Negro League players to play with dignity, doing so while having its own complex history with racism. The country is probably most well known for the Panama Canal, which was built primarily with the help of underpaid black migrants from Barbados, and is said to have been one of the vehicles that helped introduce baseball to the country. That canal, having its own checkered past, may be one of the roots of some of the racial issues that affect Panama today. Still, despite its issues, the country of Panama was just one of several nations to provide help for Negro League players and help forever change the game of baseball. Across the Caribbean Sea, the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico had its own long-standing relationship with black baseball. It's even said to precede the Negro National League. In 1917, same year that the Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship, Jesus Velasquez became the first Puerto Rican to play for a black ball team, although there is little information about the team he played for. In 1926, 6 years after the Negro National League was founded, Gacho Torres became the first Puerto Rican to play in the official Negro Leagues, playing for one season with the Newark Stars. The next Puerto Rican to break into the Negro Leagues was Emilio Milito Navarro, who found opportunity playing with the Cuban Stars. The experience was bittersweet for Navarro, because while he had a batting average of .337 and was afforded an opportunity to play baseball in a major league, he would face the harsh reality of racial discrimination when the team went to go play in the South. For Navarro, he felt discriminated against on two levels. One, because of the color of his skin, and two, because of his inability to speak English well. And due to this, he would go on to find opportunities on teams in Venezuela and in the Dominican Republic. The longest active Negro League player from Puerto Rico was Monchile Concepcion, who played for the Lincoln Giants, Cuban Stars East, and the Bacharach Giants. Luis Marquez became the first Puerto Rican to play in the Negro League World Series with the Homestead Grays, and would later go on to be the first black player to be signed by the Yankees. Negro League players also started playing in Puerto Rico in the early 1900s, with the Cuban Stars visiting the island as early as 1917. After them, George Scales and Chino Smith came to Puerto Rico with the Brooklyn Royal Giants. The Giants would play a Puerto Rican team called the Ponce Leones in 17 games, starting in December of 1925 and ending in January of 1926. Ponce would end up winning the series. Scales would go on to be a manager of several Puerto Rican teams for 12 seasons, leading his teams to 6 league pennants, including the Ponce Leones. For the most part, Negro League players would come to play in Puerto Rico during the winter months, and this would continue into the 1930s, with teams like the New York Black Yankees and the then Brooklyn Eagles playing there. The Puerto Rican Professional Baseball League was formed in 1938, and over the years, several Negro League stars would go on to play in Puerto Rico. Players like Josh Gibson, Roy Campanella, and Satchel Paige. In 1940, while playing for the Brujos de Guayama, Satchel Paige is said to have walked off the field after allegedly seeing a ghost standing next to him on the pitcher's mound. Even former Negro League players like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays would play in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. The presence of Negro League stars at these Winter League games didn't just give black players another safe space in Latin America, it would also inspire young Puerto Ricans to get into the game of baseball. And one of those young Puerto Ricans was Roberto Clemente, who's said to have been inspired for seeing Monty Irvin play one day. And Clemente didn't just get to see him play, he also got a glove from Irvin on that day. He would eventually go on to follow in Irvin's footsteps, becoming a right fielder and starting his career with the San Cruz Crackers, and then going on to have a Hall of Fame career with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Unlike other Latin nations, Puerto Rico is actually part of the United States, meaning that some of the same issues of discrimination that affected African Americans in the States would also end up affecting Afro-Puerto Ricans, particularly within the military. Both in the States and in Puerto Rico, military units were segregated by race. This discrimination also affected baseball, with black Puerto Ricans being excluded from the MLB, like their African American counterparts. On the island itself, Puerto Rico didn't have much of the same issues with discrimination like the other Latin nations did. and this may be one of the reasons why the relationship with the Negro League started so early. But Puerto Rico isn't perfect. In a recent census, many of Puerto Rico's black residents put white in the question of race. Still, Puerto Rico has made strides recently to combat racism and embraces black heritage, a heritage that includes its role in the racial integration of baseball. West of Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic's relationship with the Negro Leagues goes back to the 1920s, with Alex Pompez at the forefront of this relationship. In 1926, Pedro San became the first Dominican to play in the Negro Leagues and play with the Cuban Stars East, a team that was created by Pompez. Several other Dominican players would come to join him on the same team a few years later. One of those players, Gitano Vargas, would go on to become a big star in both the Negro Leagues and around the Caribbean. By the time he had retired, he had played in 5 different countries: Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, the United States, and back home in the Dominican Republic. But the most consequential and most controversial man to help define the relationship between the Negro Leagues and the Dominican Republic was the country's dictator, Rafael Trujillo. Trujillo wanted to strengthen his popularity and thought that the best way to do so was by creating a baseball team, which is how the Dragones de Ciudad Trujillo was born. The team was located in the country's capital, Santo Domingo, which at the time was renamed Ciudad Trujillo, and was comprised of 2 existing Dominican teams, Tigres del Licey and Leones del Escogido. To ensure that he would have a decent team, he stacked his roster with several players from the Negro Leagues, players like Satchel Paige, who Trujillo paid to recruit other players like Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell, which caused tension for Paige. Gus Greenlee banned him and other players that jumped from the Negro Leagues. In contrast, the players received a hero's welcome when they touched down in the Dominican Republic and were protected by Trujillo's soldiers. Well, protected as long as they won. In his autobiography, Paige talked about how those same soldiers began to look like a firing squad when the team was down a run during one of their games. And while he built it for success, Trujillo's team only played for 1 season in 1937. And during that season, the team would play against another Dominican team, the Águilas Cibaeñas from Santiago, in the 8-game series. Trujillo's team won the first 4 games, while the Águilas won the next 2, and were about to win the championship until Paige helped Trujillo's team get the win. Towards the end of the final game, the team had the lead at 6-5, when Satchel Paige struck the Águilas out in the last 2 innings. This was a huge win for Trujillo, but unfortunately for him, it would also be his last. After the Negro League players left the team, the entire Dominican Baseball League folded. As a matter of fact, baseball didn't even return to the Dominican Republic until the 1950s, and with it, so did the black ball players. And today, the Dominican Republic is responsible for most of the foreign-born players in the MLB. Like several other Latin nations, the Dominican Republic had a complex and mutually beneficial relationship with the Negro League players in America. Trujillo's team was one of the most glaring examples of that complexity, because although it provided a legitimate opportunity for black players to be honored both socially and financially, it did so under the leadership of a brutal dictator who treated his own citizens poorly while handsomely paying foreign players. Today, this dynamic can be seen in the fact that while the Dominican Republic is a popular vacation spot, many of its locals live in poverty. There's also the fact that the Dominican Republic has its own problems with racism, particularly against the Haitian community. Discrimination that Trujillo himself perpetuated during the same year he brought the Negro League players in. And if those Negro League players didn't win, they likely would have met the same fate as the Haitians in this country. And yet, despite their controversial relationship, both Negro League players and the Dominican Republic benefited from each other. The DR built the professional baseball league partially off the work that Negro League players have put in. Negro League players got a chance to be honored in ways that they just weren't in the States. This relationship also led to the many doors being opened for both African American and Dominican players to both join and make the MLB what it is today. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, Negro Leagues in Latin America built a complex and mutually beneficial relationship, one that was started by competition, but helped lead to the integration of baseball and the global expansion of it as a sport, and also introduced us to people who will become some of the greatest baseball players of all time. Doing so at a time when both African Americans and Afro-Latinos were discriminated against in their home countries, with the irony of it all being that African Americans had to leave their home countries to go play baseball with dignity and countries that had their own problems with discriminating against dark-skinned people, proving that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. But nevertheless, these complexities didn't stop that relationship from forming and building something that would become beautiful, not just diversifying the MLB, but helping lead to the creation of professional baseball leagues across many different countries. In some ways, the way that African Americans and Latino immigrants helped build up the MLB is a metaphor for how America was built. Because America is a country that was built off the backs of immigrants. And not just African slaves or Latino immigrants of all colors. And in these divisive times, team sports like baseball often remind us that we're stronger together than we are apart, no matter what color our skin is. Whether we started out at first base in Latin America or on third base in the United States. At the end of the day, we all just want to make it home.
Well, that does it for this episode, Journey Through Jerseys. Thank you so much for watching. If you like content like this, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one. Again, thank you so much for watching. God bless, and I'll see you next time.